Alright, let's begin. For most of human history, winter wasn't a season you prepared for with scented candles and a playlist. It was a recurring logistical problem that showed up every year, uninvited, and stayed far too long. Long before central heating and double-glazed windows, people survived winter through habits so dull they rarely make it into textbooks. They burned whatever would burn. They slept next to whoever radiated heat. They wore the same layers for months. And they slowly adjusted their expectations until not freezing tonight felt like a personal achievement. This is not a story of triumph. It's a very slow account of endurance, of people doing just enough year after year to reach spring, and then doing it all again. Because, of course, winter always came back. And before we drift any further into the cold, if you enjoy these long, quiet history stories, feel free to subscribe. And if you're listening late at night, you can leave a comment with your city and the time you're listening from. It's always quietly interesting to see where everyone is and how late it's gotten. Chapter 1. The long night before the fire ever went out. Take a moment to get comfortable. Shift around a little. Let the room settle. Imagine the light is low, not dramatically low, just low enough that nothing feels urgent. Outside it's cold. Inside, it's not especially warm, but it's familiar. This is about as good as it gets for now. Before furnaces, before radiators, before the polite hum of a thermostat pretending everything is under control, winter was something you lived inside of. It shaped your sleep, your posture, and your general opinion of the universe. And it began every year with darkness. In much of the northern world, winter meant the sun leaving early and returning late, if it returned at all. Evenings stretched out. Mornings arrived slowly, reluctantly, and with no real promise of warmth. Light was precious, but so was fuel, which meant you learned to sit in the dimness and make peace with it. People went to bed early not because they were disciplined, but because staying awake cost resources. Candles burned. Oil lamps drank fuel. Firewood disappeared faster than you expected. Darkness, inconvenient as it was, became a kind of budgeting strategy. Homes were built around heat, or at least the idea of it. Thick walls, small windows, low ceilings. None of this was cozy in the modern sense. It was practical. Warmth, once created, had to be trapped like a shy animal that might escape at any moment. In many early homes, there was one fire. It sat in the center of the living space, usually on a shallow hearth. Smoke wandered upward, hopefully finding its way out through a hole in the roof or a crude chimney. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. People learned to tolerate watery eyes and persistent coughing as part of the deal. Breathing easily was a summer luxury. The fire was never allowed to go out completely. Letting it die meant starting again, and starting again meant effort, sparks, and wasted fuel. Embers were buried in ash overnight. In the morning, someone would poke at them gently, coaxing heat back into existence. This was not a poetic ritual. It was a necessary one. If it failed, the house stayed cold all day, and everyone noticed. Sleeping arrangements were shaped by heat rather than privacy. Entire families slept in the same room, sometimes in the same bed, not because they were sentimental, but because bodies produced warmth. Children were useful in this regard. So were animals. In some places, livestock shared indoor space during winter. A cow or a goat might be housed close to the living area, separated by little more than a wall. The smell was unpleasant. The warmth was appreciated. This was considered a fair trade. Clothing never really came off. Layers were worn until they softened and shaped themselves to the body. Wool, linen, and whatever else was available were piled on in combinations that made movement slow and awkward. People learned to work stiffly. Grace was not expected in January. Feet were wrapped. Hands were tucked away whenever possible. Fingers lost sensation often enough that it barely registered as alarming. This was normal. You dropped things more in winter. You forgave yourself for it. Meals changed with the season. Fresh food disappeared. Diets narrowed. Stews and porridges became dominant not because they were exciting, but because they could sit on the fire all day without complaint. Warm food mattered. It made the cold feel negotiable. Water froze. Buckets turned solid overnight. Wells became difficult to access. Washing was reduced to what was strictly necessary. Cleanliness, like comfort, became seasonal. And while all of this quietly carried on, winter nights stretched on, long and uneventful. People talked less. They listened more. Stories were repeated. Silence filled the rest. Time moved differently in the cold. Days blurred together. The calendar mattered less than the weather. You measured progress in small victories. A fire that lasted through the night. A roof that didn't leak snow. A morning where your breath didn't fog quite as much inside the house. No one expected winter to be pleasant. That expectation simply didn't exist. The goal was to endure it without serious loss. Anything beyond that was considered fortunate. Let's drift, slowly, to a slightly later world, where buildings grew more complex but winter remained unimpressed. Chapter 2. Medieval houses and the art of staying near the wall. By the Middle Ages, people had learned a few new tricks, but winter remained stubbornly familiar. Houses were more permanent now, built from stone or heavy timber, which helped in some ways and made things worse in others. Stone kept out the wind. It also stored cold very efficiently, like a thoughtful little vault of misery. Rooms were still few. Fires were still limited. Even in homes with multiple hearths, fuel was expensive and fires were rationed. The Great Hall might be warm. Everything else was aspirational. People gravitated toward walls, corners, and anything that blocked drafts. Furniture placement mattered. Beds were tucked away from windows. Tapestries hung on walls not for decoration, but because fabric trapped heat. A beautifully woven tapestry was nice to look at, of course, but more importantly, it stopped the cold stone from pressing directly into the room. Floors were layered with rushes or straw. Not clean straw. Use straw. It absorbed spills, dirt, and whatever else happened indoors during the winter months. It also provided a thin layer of insulation between feet and frozen ground. This was considered adequate. Chimneys improved smoke problems but created new ones. Heat escaped upward, pulled away by drafts that did not care how long you spent gathering firewood. People responded by building fires that burned slowly and produced a lot of smoke. You learned to live with it. Nighttime clothing grew heavier. Nightcaps were worn to prevent heat loss from the head. Blankets multiplied. Featherbeds appeared for those who could afford them. For everyone else, there was wool, more wool, and resignation. The concept of being warm was relative. Comfort was measured against last winter, not against any imagined ideal. If you were slightly less cold than the year before, things were improving. Chapter 2. Medieval houses and the art of staying near the wall. In winter, movement inside a medieval house followed invisible lines of heat. People learned where warmth collected and where it disappeared. You didn't cross a room casually. You migrated slowly, deliberately, from one tolerable spot to another, like an animal testing thin ice. The hearth dominated daily life. Not emotionally, practically. Whoever controlled the fire controlled the room. This wasn't a power struggle so much as a quiet acknowledgement of physics. The fire dictated where you sat, where you worked, and where you placed anything that benefited from not freezing. Cooking happened slowly, partly because haste wasted fuel. Pots were left to simmer for hours. Stirring was occasional and unenthusiastic. Nobody rushed a stew in January. The fire would be there all day anyway, assuming it behaved. Fuel was always on someone's mind. Firewood had to be gathered in advance, stacked carefully, and protected from moisture. Wet wood smoked. Smoky wood made everyone irritable and slightly unwell. Dry wood was precious, and it was burned with restraint bordering on suspicion. Peat was used in some regions, dug from bogs and dried long before winter arrived. It burned slowly and produced a thick, lingering smoke that clung to hair and clothing. People smelled like winter constantly. There was no escaping it. The scent followed you indoors, outdoors, and into sleep. Charcoal appeared in wealthier homes, burned for its cleaner heat. It was efficient, controlled, and expensive. Like many small comforts, it was admired from a distance by those who couldn't afford it. Windows remained small and inconvenient. Glass was rare and imperfect. Shutters were closed early, sealing in darkness along with the cold. Light faded quickly in winter afternoons, and the interior world shrank with it. Daily routines adjusted. Tasks that required dexterity were done earlier, while fingers still cooperated. As the day darkened and cooled, work slowed. Spinning, mending, and quiet repairs replaced anything requiring precision. Mistakes were blamed on the cold and forgiven. Bathing was rare, not because people disliked cleanliness, but because heating enough water was impractical and risky. Exposure after bathing was dangerous. Better to stay slightly dirty than dangerously cold. This calculation was made without much debate. Beds were built high off the ground to avoid drafts. Curtains were hung around them, forming fabric enclosures that trapped body heat. These bed hangings were not decorative flourishes. They were survival tools. Sleeping positions mattered. People curled inward. Blankets were tucked tightly. Movement was minimized. The goal was to maintain whatever warmth you had managed to generate before falling asleep. Waking up cold was expected. Waking up warmer was not. Morning began reluctantly. Rising meant leaving the bed, and leaving the bed meant immediate discomfort. People lingered as long as possible, negotiating with themselves. Eventually, necessity won. Bread was often warmed by the fire before eating. Cold bread was unpleasant. Warm bread felt reassuring even when it was stale. Small improvements mattered in winter. They accumulated into something like morale. Animals remained close. Cats were tolerated generously. Dogs were welcome near the fire. Livestock stayed in adjacent spaces, their heat seeping through walls and floors. Human and animal lives overlapped more tightly in winter, out of convenience rather than affection. Illness spread easily in enclosed spaces. Colds lingered. Coughs echoed through houses for months. Remedies were mild and repetitive. Drinks, herbal infusions. Rest when possible. Nobody expected quick recoveries. Churches were cold. Stone buildings absorbed winter and returned it faithfully. Congregations sat wrapped in layers, listening patiently while breath fogged the air. Faith did not warm the room, but it passed the time. And winter passed slowly, measured in meals and fires tended. Nobody counted days. They counted supplies. When spring finally arrived, it did so without ceremony. The cold loosened its grip gradually, as if reluctant to admit defeat. People noticed small changes. Easier mornings. Less smoke indoors. Fingers that moved more freely. Then preparations began again. Because winter would return. It always did. And while medieval houses grew sturdier, winter remained unimpressed. It waited, as it always had, for people to make their adjustments and lower their expectations once more. Chapter 3: Early Modern Winters and the Illusion of Improvement. By the early modern period, roughly the 16th and 17th centuries, people liked to believe they had made progress. Buildings were more refined. Chimneys were standard. Rooms were more numerous. Privacy existed, at least on paper. Winter, however, remained entirely unconvinced. Fireplaces multiplied, but so did drafts. Chimneys pulled heat upward with impressive efficiency. The fire warmed the immediate area and politely evacuated the rest of the warmth straight into the sky. People responded by sitting very close to the hearth and pretending this was intentional. Coal entered domestic life in larger quantities, especially in urban areas. It burned hotter and longer than wood, which sounded like an improvement. It also produced thick, choking smoke and a fine black dust that coated everything. Houses became warmer and dirtier simultaneously. This was accepted as progress. Cities developed their own winter personalities. Narrow streets blocked wind but trapped cold air. Smoke hung low. Sunlight struggled to reach ground level. Winter felt heavier in towns, pressing inward from all sides. Rural homes fared differently. Space was plentiful. Fuel was closer. Isolation was greater. Snow blocked roads. Communities shrank inward. Visits became rare and purposeful. Loneliness was another winter condition, endured quietly. Animals followed similar routines. They moved less, did more, conserved energy. Humans watched and learned without formalizing it. Illness lingered longer in winter, partly because recovery required rest and warmth, both in limited supply. Care was quiet and repetitive. Drinks, covering. Waiting. Winter sharpened attention to small changes. A colder draft. A dwindling woodpile. A cough that lasted too long. Awareness replaced optimism. Time continued its slow loop. Days passed without ceremony. Survival was not celebrated. It was expected. Chapter 5. Forgotten winter jobs and the quiet economy of cold. Winter created its own forms of labor, subtle, repetitive, and rarely mentioned in histories written for excitement. These were the tasks that made life bearable in the cold, the slow undercurrent of survival that required patience more than strength. Some jobs existed entirely because of the season. Ice cutters, for example, harvested frozen rivers and ponds, slicing slabs carefully and storing them in insulated ice houses. Ice was precious, reserved for the wealthy or for preserving delicate foods. The work was monotonous, cold, and precise. Hands froze quickly. Fingers became numb, making mistakes more likely. And still, people returned each winter, quietly expecting nothing more than the endurance of the next day. Chimney sweeps experienced a similar rhythm, though indoors. Sooty and silent, they climbed up flues, brushing, scraping, and clearing pathways for smoke to escape. It was not glamorous. It was necessary. Fires burned better afterward, which meant warmth lasted longer for everyone else. Chimney sweeps were often children, moving carefully so as not to fall, learning to respect darkness and tight spaces early. Fishermen adapted their routines as water froze. Nets were repaired, boats maintained, ice broke carefully when necessary. They were active only in the daylight hours that mattered, conserving energy and keeping their bodies functional despite the cold. Success was measured in survival and small yields, not profit. Farmhands had their own winter adjustments. Livestock needed tending, feed measured and rationed, shelters checked for drafts. Water had to be carried from wells or melted from snow. Fields rested, but work did not stop entirely, it just shifted. People discovered that survival in winter meant knowing exactly which tasks could wait and which could not. Middling towns developed winter-specific trades as well. Candle makers were busiest now, their products essential. Soap boiling, basket weaving, rope twisting, all of these quiet, indoor trades saw demand rise when outdoor activity slowed. Efficiency mattered. People performed these jobs repetitively, rhythmically, almost meditating on their monotony. Even within homes, certain roles became more demanding. Servants had to manage fires constantly, adjust bedding, monitor the temperature of rooms, and ensure food remained warm. Their work was quiet but relentless. Mistakes were inconvenient and sometimes painful, but winter rarely demanded perfection. It demanded endurance. Winter also fostered specialized repair tasks. Leatherworkers repaired stiff boots, replacing soles that cracked in the cold. Tailors patched thick woolen garments, preparing them for the months ahead. Tools were sharpened and oiled to withstand frost. Every household item had a seasonally adjusted routine. And in all of this, time stretched. Days felt longer because movement was slower, because warmth required effort, and because activity itself consumed energy that could not be replaced freely. Every job, no matter how mundane, became part of a collective negotiation with the cold. People learned to value repetition, predictability, and careful planning. Errors were quietly corrected. Failures were endured without fanfare. Comfort arrived incrementally, measured in warmth retained, fuel conserved, and the absence of minor disasters. The economic and social rhythms of winter revolved around these tasks, unnoticed in broader histories but crucial in daily life. Survival was a quiet project, undertaken one repetitive motion at a time, with the cold as a constant supervisor. Chapter 6: Personal Routines and the Subtle Art of Conserving Warmth. Winter shaped not just jobs, but the most intimate, repetitive aspects of daily life. Every person developed a rhythm tuned to the cold, often without thinking about it. These were the quiet routines that allowed people to survive, not heroically, but with minimal suffering. Mornings were a negotiation. Leaving bed meant exposure to the chill that had crept in overnight. Feet touched frozen floors. Breath fogged in dim rooms. People lingered under layers, pulling cloaks closer, tucking fingers beneath blankets. the warmth of a nearby body or a small ember was more persuasive than any abstract need to rise. Clothing became a constant companion. Layers were worn throughout the day, adjusted subtly. Cloaks, shawls, and woolen caps were removed only when heat threatened comfort. Nightcaps remained on during sleep. Socks were rotated, dried near fires, and kept for careful reuse. Every piece of clothing was both protection and a tool, its placement and arrangement studied unconsciously over seasons. Meal routines adapted. Breakfasts were modest, often a warm porridge or bread softened by fire heat. Midday meals were heavier, time to provide fuel for the longest part of the day. Evenings focused on warmth as much as nutrition, with stews, gruels, or roasted root vegetables offering both heat and sustenance. Timing and repetition mattered more than variety. Hygiene was adjusted to avoid unnecessary cold exposure. Bathing was infrequent, usually limited to lukewarm water heated over the fire. Hair was washed selectively. Clothing was cleaned slowly and deliberately, often near heat sources to avoid freezing before use. Comfort dictated priorities over ideals of cleanliness. Work and leisure merged with survival. Spinning, weaving, mending, and small repairs dominated indoor hours. Hands were kept moving to maintain circulation. When work paused, quiet storytelling or reading provided mental stimulation while conserving energy. Tasks were repeated methodically, almost ritualistically. Movement was economical. People walked carefully, avoiding drafts and conserving warmth. Drafty corridors, poorly sealed doors, and icy floors were navigated with deliberation. Errands were bundled. Activities requiring exposure were scheduled during daylight, when light and marginal warmth coincided. Sleep routines became strategic. Beds were layered with blankets, cloaks, and sometimes feathers. Shared sleeping spaces multiplied warmth. Body heat was carefully distributed through position and arrangement. Nighttime adjustments were frequent but minimal, avoiding wasted energy. Waking moments were calculated, brief, and intentional. Even social interaction was influenced by the cold. People gravitated toward the fire or the warmest part of a room. Conversations were low in energy, conserving heat and voice. Noise was reduced to preserve tranquility, and long debates or strenuous activity were postponed until conditions improved. Animals influenced routines as well. Pets and livestock were incorporated into warmth strategies. Cats curled near fires. Dogs lay on straw mats inside shelters. Chickens, goats, or cows were kept in proximity when possible, their body heat contributing silently to domestic comfort. Throughout all these behaviors, anticipation mattered. Every action considered tomorrow, the availability of fuel, the condition of clothes, and the likely progression of temperature. Winter demanded planning not as a formality, but as a necessity, quietly shaping decision-making at every level. In sum, personal routines became an intricate dance with the season. They were repetitive, deliberate, and minimally expressive. Comfort was incremental. Warmth was conserved. Energy was rationed. Survival was quiet, steady, and highly attentive to detail. Chapter 7. Regional variations and the patient adaptations of place. Winter did not behave the same way everywhere. Geography shaped survival, subtly and insistently. People living near coasts faced damp cold that seeped into bones, while those inland contended with dry frost that cracked skin and stiffened joints. Mountains brought persistent snow, forcing extended indoor life, whereas valleys allowed fleeting sunlight that people treasured silently. In northern regions, snow became a constant companion. Roofs were steep, designed to shed it, but inside, spaces remained insulated with straw, wool, and rushes. People moved deliberately, avoiding slips and conserving energy. Roads were impassable at times, isolating villages for days or weeks. This enforced a slow, measured lifestyle. Tasks were planned for efficiency, errands were consolidated, and travel only occurred when essential. Silence became habitual, punctuated by the rare sound of scraping ice or the occasional animal moving through snow. Coastal populations dealt with wind as much as cold. Salt-laden air penetrated homes, corroded tools, and stiffened clothing fibers. Fires burned with extra attention, both for warmth and to dry garments. Fishers and sailors adapted to the unpredictable sea, mending nets indoors, drying sails near heat, and timing outings with tides and daylight. Communities developed informal calendars around weather patterns, tracking frost and storm arrival with careful observation. In central plains and river valleys, winters brought extended darkness more than snow. People relied on indoor occupations, weaving, mending, preparing food supplies for the season ahead. Markets slowed, but food preservation became an art. Cellars were stocked with root vegetables, salted meats, and fermented products. Daily activity followed natural light, with productivity peaking in the hours when light and marginal warmth coincided. Urban centers introduced another layer of complexity. Smoke and soot mixed with snow and ice, coating streets with a gray paste that lingered all winter. Heat was unevenly distributed. Wealthier homes stayed warm, while the lower floors of tenements froze. People learned the subtle art of navigating cold pockets indoors, clustering near stoves, sharing rooms, and rotating positions to balance warmth and personal space. Coal became essential, and the management of it, a careful rationing, splitting, and stacking, dominated household routines. Mountainous regions demanded specialized knowledge. Slopes retained snow longer, avalanches threatened silently, and the thin air amplified cold. Travel relied on skis or snowshoes, not for sport but survival. Winter occupations were adjusted. Shepherds guided flocks to sheltered valleys, while hunters and gatherers modified schedules to maximize daylight and conserve energy. Across all regions, certain adaptations were universal: layering clothing, clustering for warmth, conserving fuel, adjusting daily routines to light and temperature, and developing an acute awareness of environmental conditions. Local variations existed in materials, methods, and timing, but the underlying principle remained constant: slow, deliberate endurance. In homes, the architecture reflected local climate. Roofs, walls, windows, and floors were designed not for comfort, but for minimizing heat loss. Thick walls, small openings, and insulated floors were common in severe climates. Interiors emphasized practicality. Spaces were arranged to maximize heat, rooms were closed off strategically, and beds were positioned to capture the most residual warmth from fires. These regional adaptations also shaped social behavior. Families huddled together longer in colder areas. Work was coordinated to optimize efficiency. Communities developed unspoken rules about sharing fuel, food, and space. Mutual endurance was a quiet social contract, enforced by necessity rather than law. Winter was thus both universal and idiosyncratic. Its presence was consistent, but its impact varied according to geography, architecture, and local resources. People learned to observe, adjust, and anticipate. They developed knowledge passed quietly between generations: which wood burned best, which spots in the home retained heat, which hours were safest for travel. Survival in winter became as much a mental practice as a physical one. Anticipation, careful observation, and incremental adjustments mattered more than heroism or sudden effort. Life moved deliberately, with each day a quiet negotiation between human routine and environmental demands. Chapter 8: The Slow Evolution of Heating and the Subtle Shift of Comfort. As centuries progressed, humans began experimenting more deliberately with ways to manipulate winter indoors. These efforts were gradual, incremental, and rarely transformative all at once. Heat moved from a natural consequence of fire to something that could be stored, directed, and, eventually, controlled. In wealthier households, multiple fireplaces appeared, each occupying a different room. This allowed partial control over temperature, though managing them required constant attention. Servants or family members became responsible for feeding fires, monitoring smoke, and adjusting flues. Each hearth was a microcosm of winter strategy: burn enough to sustain warmth, but not so much as to waste fuel or overheat a room. Coal began to replace wood in many regions, particularly in urban areas. It burned longer, hotter, and more predictably, though it brought smoke and black dust as silent companions. Houses required careful ventilation. Coal consumption needed careful monitoring. The benefits were tangible: slightly longer comfort, less frequent tending, and a modest increase in the predictability of indoor temperature. Cast iron stoves emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, offering a new approach. They concentrated heat, radiated slowly, and allowed one to heat spaces more evenly. Their weight and efficiency encouraged people to reorganize rooms, clustering around warmth and optimizing furniture placement. Fires were still central, but now the control felt marginally more precise. Heat was stored in rudimentary ways long before modern systems arrived. Beds were warmed with hot bricks or pans of coals, carefully placed to radiate heat through the night. Water was heated slowly, then preserved for multiple uses. Cooking fires doubled as sources of ambient warmth. Every act became multifunctional, practical, efficient, and largely repetitive. Architecture adapted slowly alongside these innovations. Thick walls retained heat. Small windows limited loss. Tapestries and rugs insulated further, not for decoration, but for the subtle management of indoor climate. The arrangement of rooms, doors, and sleeping areas reflected centuries of observation about where warmth accumulated and where it dissipated. Even the perception of comfort shifted gradually. People became more sensitive to indoor temperature. Rooms considered tolerable in the past were now experienced as chilly. Mild warmth became expected. Comfort moved from survival threshold to desirable standard. Public buildings experimented with early forms of centralized heat. Offices, courts, and larger homes began installing stoves connected by ductwork or using circulating air systems. Steam heat appeared in institutional settings, distributing warmth more evenly than open fires could. These systems required maintenance, oversight, and careful planning. Failures were disruptive, but successes were quietly celebrated as incremental improvements. Despite these advances, the underlying rhythms of winter life persisted. Clothing remained layered. Nights were still long. Daily schedules still followed light and temperature. Heat made life less brutal, but it did not eliminate the subtle negotiations of winter. People still clustered, planned, and conserved, though now with slightly more predictability. Even with heating improvements, winter remained indifferent. It adjusted only slowly to human interventions. Technology extended comfort marginally, allowed a few luxuries, and reduced overt suffering. But it did not erase the season's presence. Snow still fell. Frost still crept under doors. Cold remained an occasional visitor, reminding inhabitants of its quiet authority. Chapter 9: Urban Winters and the Quiet Politics of Warmth. As towns and cities grew in the 18th and 19th centuries, winter took on a new dimension. It was no longer just a season of survival, it also became a subtle measure of inequality. Access to warmth quietly reflected social standing, though the rules were rarely explicit. Urban homes were layered vertically. Upper floors often benefited from residual heat rising from lower rooms. Basements and lower levels remained cold and damp, even when the fire burned efficiently. Tenants adapted by clustering near stoves, sharing beds, and rotating positions to preserve what little heat existed. Every movement was strategic, every adjustment measured. Comfort was not evenly distributed. Wealthier households employed multiple servants to manage fires, prepare warm foods, and maintain clothing. They had access to coal, imported fuels, and cast iron stoves. Windows were glazed, floors insulated, and bedrooms curtained for maximum retention. Their winter experience was gentler, though still requiring attention and care. Luxury did not erase labor, it simply shifted it elsewhere. Lower-income families experienced winter as an exercise in improvisation. Fires were small, fuel rationed, and rooms crowded. Clothing was layered, reused, and patched repeatedly. Water froze in buckets. Floors remained icy. Yet people adapted, developing remarkable skill in conserving heat, coordinating movement, and prioritizing essential tasks. Survival relied on observation, memory, and subtle negotiation between bodies, fires, and limited fuel. Public spaces reflected this hierarchy as well. Schools, offices, and churches provided uneven warmth. One corner might bask in residual heat, another remained icy. Attendance was influenced by these variations. People learned where to sit, when to arrive, and how to balance comfort with social expectation. Even seating became a negotiation with temperature. Urban winters also encouraged new forms of labor. Coal delivery expanded into a seasonal rhythm. Drivers and porters moved large quantities of fuel daily, often in bitter cold. Chimney sweeps remained active, clearing soot to ensure fires burned efficiently. Artisans and tradespeople produced winter-specific goods: thick textiles, boots, blankets, and hot water containers. Each occupation reinforced the quiet economy of warmth. Noise became a companion of winter in cities. Carts rattled on frozen streets. Stoves hissed. Smoke chimneys groaned. People developed an internal patience for these sounds, which punctuated daily life without altering routines. Silence was no longer constant. It was interrupted by mechanical and social necessity. Winter also structured time socially. People moved cautiously outdoors, clustered indoors, and coordinated visits to share warmth, food, or companionship. Visiting neighbors wasn't purely social, it was a strategic sharing of body heat and resources. Small gifts, extra coal, a candle, or a preserved food, functioned as both kindness and survival tool. Even clothing reflected social distinction. Wool, furs, and multiple layers were more available to the wealthy. The poor layered more creatively, patched cloaks, hand-knit socks, and shared garments. Fashion became a negotiation with warmth rather than aesthetics. Utility dictated form. Despite these differences, certain practices were universal. People clustered near fires. Blankets were layered. Nights were long. Food was timed for energy. Routines were repetitive, deliberate, and highly attentive to temperature. Winter remained the constant authority, indifferent to status, requiring adaptation at every level. And so, urban winter life was a subtle choreography. Each household, each person, navigated temperature, fuel, and time with quiet precision. The season dictated behavior more effectively than laws, traditions, or social expectation. Hierarchies affected comfort but never eliminated winter's persistent influence. Through observation, planning, and incremental adaptation, people survived. Not heroically, not dramatically, but reliably. Warmth was negotiated continuously, a resource to manage, share, and preserve. Winter was not conquered. It was accommodated, patiently and quietly, by those who understood its rhythms. Chapter 10: Domestic Strategies and the Slow Endurance of Long Nights. Winter within the home became a carefully orchestrated series of routines, often invisible to outsiders but essential for survival. Families and households developed strategies that balanced warmth, labor, and endurance, all while accepting the inevitability of cold. One of the most obvious strategies involved the management of fire. Hearths remained the center of domestic life, not as decoration, but as the literal axis around which activity revolved. Firewood was rationed. Coal was monitored. Embers were preserved overnight in ash. Every adjustment mattered. One misjudgment could leave a room, or a house, uncomfortably cold for hours. Rooms were arranged to maximize warmth. Furniture clustered around heat sources. Curtains, tapestries, and blankets acted as barriers, trapping residual warmth. Bedrooms were curtained to form microclimates. Beds were layered with wool, feathers, and whatever padding was available. Occupants learned instinctively how to distribute heat, who slept closest to the center, who shared blankets, and how to position themselves to conserve warmth over the long night. Cooking served dual purposes. Food provided calories, yes, but the preparation process also radiated heat. Kitchens were rarely idle. Pots simmered for hours. Fires were tended slowly to maintain both temperature and energy efficiency. Hot meals were scheduled strategically, timed to coincide with the coldest periods of the day. Household routines adjusted to light and warmth. Mornings began late. People lingered in bed or near embers, delaying exposure to cold floors and drafty corridors. Tasks requiring dexterity were performed during daylight, when visibility and residual warmth from sunlight combined to make work tolerable. Even minor errands were consolidated. A single trip could accomplish multiple tasks, reducing exposure to both cold and exhaustion. Clothing was adapted into a continuous system. Layers were not removed unless absolutely necessary. Nightcaps stayed on during sleep. Socks and wraps were rotated and dried near fires. People learned through trial and error which combinations offered the most warmth with the least restriction. Over time, this knowledge became instinctual, a quiet skill passed from parent to child. Movement itself was deliberate. Walking across rooms, tending fires, or moving from bed to table required careful pacing. Overexertion led to sweating, which became an enemy as moisture cooled rapidly. Underexertion risked stiffness and frostbite in harsher environments. A balance was learned subtly and over years of experience. Social interaction adapted to temperature. Conversations were low in energy, often occurring near fires or in tightly clustered spaces. Silence was accepted, even welcomed, as a way to conserve both warmth and energy. Noise, like heat, was treated as a resource, used sparingly. Animals were integrated into domestic heating strategies. Pets curled near fires. Livestock might be housed nearby, sharing warmth with humans and each other. Their presence became part of the household climate, unremarkable yet functionally essential. Psychological adaptation was as important as physical adjustment. Long nights and dim light encouraged patience, routine, and an acceptance of monotony. People learned to measure progress in small increments. A fire that lasted longer, a layer of clothing that stayed dry, a meal that remained hot. Achievements were subtle but meaningful. Even leisure followed these constraints. Reading, weaving, or quiet storytelling occurred in specific spots, timed for warmth and light. Activities that demanded energy or exposed people to drafts were postponed. Time itself seemed to stretch, measured not by clocks but by the slow ebb and flow of heat and light. Winter endurance, domestically, was a lesson in quiet negotiation. Success was defined not by triumph or comfort, but by survival with minimal suffering, by routines repeated with precision and patience. Chapter 11: Winter Labor, Frozen Transport, and the Quiet Economy of Snow. Beyond the walls of homes, winter demanded a different kind of attention. Work continued, but it moved slowly, deliberately, and only where necessary. Cold shaped schedules, routes, and the rhythm of effort, creating an economy of endurance that was subtle, patient, and largely invisible in official records. Rural labor slowed but never stopped entirely. Fields rested under snow, but livestock required constant care. Animals needed feeding, water, and shelter. Fodder had to be measured and rationed carefully, distributed to prevent waste. Frozen troughs had to be chipped free. Every task demanded attention and minimized exposure to the cold. Movement was efficient, economical, almost ritualistic. Forests and woodlands were sources of fuel, and timber work continued with modified expectations. Woodcutters chose daylight hours carefully, avoiding the most bitter cold. Tools had to be handled cautiously, as metal stiffened and brittle branches became unpredictable. Snow made travel slow, but it also preserved paths in some regions. People learned to read frozen terrain intuitively, adjusting their steps and loads to minimize effort and maximize safety. Ice harvesting was a specialized winter labor. Workers cut slabs from rivers and ponds, stacking them in insulated ice houses for months of later use. The work was repetitive, cold, and physically demanding, but essential for food preservation. Success required both strength and patience. Too much haste risked injury, too little efficiency threatened the supply. The rhythm of cutting, moving, and stacking became a quiet routine, passed down among those who knew it best. Transportation slowed dramatically in winter. Snow and ice made roads treacherous. Carts and wagons moved carefully, often carrying essential goods only. Trade persisted, but slowly. Merchants consolidated loads, planned trips around weather, and timed departures to daylight hours. Delay was accepted, complaints muted, because the alternative, risk and loss, was worse. In towns and cities, coal and firewood deliveries became critical tasks. Drivers and porters navigated icy streets, moving heavy loads to maintain warmth in countless homes. Chimneys were swept to ensure efficient fires. Public stoves and communal hearths were tended diligently. Even minor lapses in fuel management could have cascading effects, so attention to routine was paramount. Winter trades shifted indoors whenever possible. Weavers, knitters, and other artisans focused on small-scale production that required minimal heat exposure. Repairs of clothing, footwear, and household items dominated work schedules. Productivity was slow, predictable, and repetitive, but effective. Life in winter rewarded consistency over speed. Communities adapted collectively. Snow clearing was often cooperative, with neighbors working together to maintain essential pathways. Shared labor minimized individual exposure and maximized utility. Information about weather, ice thickness, and road conditions circulated quietly, forming a network of knowledge essential for survival. Even small economies reflected winter's authority. Prices of fuel rose slightly with scarcity. Labor availability fluctuated with the harshness of weather. Seasonal trades became cyclical, predictable, and intimately tied to the rhythms of cold, light, and snow accumulation. Throughout all of this, humans learned to negotiate winter rather than fight it. Success was measured in small increments. A well-fed animal, a stable pile of firewood, a safe passage over ice. There was no drama, only careful attention, patience, and repetition. Winter imposed limits, but it also fostered expertise. People became attuned to subtle cues: frost thickness, wind direction, snow density, and the performance of tools in cold conditions. Every observation informed future decisions, quietly improving endurance. And so, the economy of winter, labor, transport, trade, and community coordination functioned slowly, predictably, and largely unnoticed. It was an invisible framework that allowed survival in cold months, a testament to the patient intelligence humans applied to the relentless season. Chapter 12: Indoor Pastimes, Quiet Occupations, and the Slow Culture of Winter. Winter nights were long, and while labor continued where necessary, there were hours that could not be spent tending animals, fires, or streets. People filled this time in subtle ways, quietly, almost imperceptibly, shaping a culture of endurance that blended necessity with minimal amusement. Reading existed but was limited by light and resources. Candles were precious, trimmed carefully, used sparingly. Books were handled gently, pages turned deliberately. Knowledge was consumed slowly, not for excitement but for quiet contemplation. Literacy, when available, allowed some degree of mental escape, but always within the constraints of warmth and attention. Storytelling persisted as a domestic ritual. Tales were told without flourish, often repeating familiar narratives. The pleasure was not in suspense or drama, but in the rhythm of words, the cadence of memory, and the company of others. Everyone knew the ending. That was part of the comfort. Predictability was soothing. Repetition was reassuring. Music, when present, followed a similar logic. Instruments were played softly. Songs were slow and low. The act of performance was as much about marking the passage of time as entertainment. Noise was a resource to be managed, energy and warmth were conserved. Even singing was deliberate, measured, and minimally taxing. Handwork dominated indoor hours. Spinning, knitting, mending, weaving, and embroidery kept hands warm and minds engaged. These activities were repetitive, predictable, and quietly productive. They served practical purposes, maintaining clothing, preparing gifts, or generating small sources of income. Each movement was slow, deliberate, and unhurried. Efficiency was valued, but urgency was rare. Children were integrated into these routines. They learned to sit patiently, observe, and participate in small tasks. Games were simple, requiring minimal movement and no exposure to cold. Learning patience, repetition, and careful attention became as essential as reading or counting. Winter shaped childhood quietly, molding both skill and temperament. Even domestic chores adopted a slow rhythm. Water had to be carried from wells or melted from snow. Clothes were washed carefully, dried near fires, and folded for efficiency. Floors were swept, ashes managed, and fires tended in small increments. Every action was measured against both energy expenditure and warmth retention. Social rituals adjusted as well. Neighbors might exchange visits, not for conversation alone but for shared warmth and small economies of fuel. Gifts were modest: extra firewood, a candle, preserved food. Interaction was functional as well as social, a subtle negotiation with both necessity and the season. Illness and fatigue required particular management. Winter exacerbated both, and care was quiet and repetitive. Hot drinks, layered clothing, and strategic warmth were administered without urgency. Recovery was slow, measured in increments of comfort and attention rather than dramatic interventions. Even time itself felt altered. Long nights encouraged observation of small changes: how quickly embers faded, which corner retained warmth, the precise moment frost appeared on a window pane. Days were marked not by clocks but by cycles of light, heat, labor, and rest. Rhythm replaced drama. Consistency replaced surprise. Through all of this, people cultivated patience, careful attention, and a quiet resilience. Winter shaped not only physical survival but also mental and social habits. Every hour was occupied thoughtfully, every action tempered by experience and foresight. In the long arc of the season, entertainment, labor, and domestic management merged into a continuous, deliberate flow. Comfort was incremental. Productivity was modest. Life moved slowly, deliberately, and without spectacle. Chapter 13: Seasonal Psychology, Anticipation, and the Slow Shaping of Human Behavior. Winter exerted influence not just on bodies or routines, but on the mind. Long nights, short days, and persistent cold shaped thought, expectation, and behavior in subtle, cumulative ways. People learned to anticipate discomfort, plan for it, and adjust desires accordingly, often without realizing the extent to which the season guided their lives. Anticipation began long before the first frost. Families monitored weather patterns, sky color, and river conditions. They stored fuel, preserved food, and repaired clothing. Every preparation was a mental rehearsal for months of reduced mobility and exposure to cold. Anticipation was practical, not anxious, and it became habitual over generations. Daily pacing adjusted instinctively. People learned which tasks required energy, which could wait, and which should be combined for efficiency. The mind became attuned to temperature, light, and fatigue, predicting how each day would unfold. Even minor deviations, unexpected frost, a delayed fire, a frozen water source, were processed with calm adaptation. Emotional responses were muted, surprise was minimized. Repetitive tasks reinforced psychological resilience. Spinning, knitting, sweeping, and feeding fires all served dual purposes: practical maintenance and mental conditioning. The repetitive rhythm created a quiet stability. Thoughts moved slowly, in step with hands, embers, and the passage of light. Anxiety was managed not through distraction but through the predictable cadence of work and warmth. Isolation in winter had a subtle effect. People spent more time in close quarters, interacting with fewer individuals. Social circles narrowed. Conversation became measured and efficient. Solitude was prolonged, teaching self-reliance and the patience to endure both quiet and darkness. Reflection deepened. Minds accustomed themselves to minimal stimulation. Expectations shifted as well. Comfort became relative, measured against the previous night, the remaining fuel, or the thickness of one's bedding. Small improvements, extra warmth from a well-fed fire, dry clothing, or a modest meal, produced satisfaction disproportionate to their apparent significance. Desire adjusted downward naturally, aligning with what could realistically be achieved. Children absorbed these psychological lessons early. Play was tempered by practicality. Movement was moderated to conserve energy. Observation, patience, and quiet attention became central to childhood experience. They learned to navigate both the physical and mental landscapes of winter simultaneously. Communities reinforced these adjustments collectively. Shared routines, such as cooperative fire tending, ice harvesting, or bundled errands, reduced uncertainty. Predictable schedules and established rhythms minimized cognitive load. People did not have to constantly anticipate disaster. They learned, slowly, that survival was embedded in routine, repetition, and patience. Even leisure and amusement reflected winter's subtle shaping of mind. Games, stories, and music were low energy, repetitive, and predictable. Novelty was rare. Expectation was tempered. Minds practiced endurance through mental monotony as much as through physical restraint. Sleep patterns were similarly adjusted. Nights were long, but interruptions were frequent due to cold or illness. People adapted, developing strategies to maximize rest, layering, clustering, and alternating positions. The mind learned to drift, pause, and reorient, reinforcing the quiet rhythm of seasonal life. Chapter 14: Clothing, Textiles, and the Intimate Art of Layering. Winter shaped what people wore, not merely for fashion, but as a crucial survival strategy. Clothing became a tool, a buffer against cold, and an extension of daily routine. Each layer, each material, and each arrangement carried practical significance that was quietly learned and meticulously applied. Wool dominated. It absorbed moisture, retained heat, and remained functional even when damp. People wore multiple layers of wool, often combining undergarments, tunics, cloaks, and stockings. The sequence mattered. Base layers kept skin dry, middle layers trapped warmth, outer layers shielded against wind and snow. Knowledge of this order was practical, intuitive, and learned through observation and experience rather than instruction. Fur was a luxury and a necessity. In colder regions, furs lined cloaks, hats, and gloves. They added insulation without restricting movement excessively. The wealthy wore furs visibly. The less affluent sometimes salvaged scraps or repurposed worn garments to achieve similar effects. Ingenuity mattered more than status when the season demanded survival. Layering was dynamic. Indoors, some layers could be removed to prevent overheating near the fire. Outdoors, the same garments were combined differently to guard against wind, snow, or frostbite. Quick adjustments became second nature, executed without conscious thought. Every movement, every addition or removal of a layer had consequences for warmth, comfort, and energy conservation. Nightwear reflected the same careful reasoning. Bedclothes were layered heavily. Cloaks, shawls, and blankets were worn to sleep. Socks stayed on. Hot bricks or pans were inserted into beds to radiate heat through the night. Positioning in the bed was deliberate. Those closer to embers or shared body heat occupied the center, others the edges. Small details, repeated season after season, mattered for restful sleep. Footwear required particular attention. Leather stiffened in cold. Soles cracked. Boots were stuffed with straw or cloth to maintain warmth. Repair and maintenance were continuous tasks. Shoes and boots were not merely protective, they were essential instruments for endurance. Hands and heads were similarly managed. Gloves, mittens, and caps prevented heat loss from extremities. Layering was common: inner mittens, outer gloves, cloth caps beneath fur hats. Fingers were manipulated carefully to avoid frostbite. Hands were active enough to stay warm, but not so much as to sweat excessively, which would cool them too rapidly. Textiles themselves became a focus of domestic labor. Spinning, weaving, and knitting occupied hours of indoor life. These tasks produced functional clothing, maintained the household economy, and reinforced patterns of repetition and attention. Each stitch, each thread, contributed to survival in ways that were subtle yet essential. Children's clothing followed similar logic. They wore layered garments for protection, sometimes oversized to allow growth or multiple seasons of use. Mobility was considered carefully. Layers needed to preserve warmth without restricting movement entirely. Play and daily tasks were accounted for in garment choice. Winter attire was also social. Clothing signaled status, occupation, and skill in domestic management. However, practicality always outweighed aesthetics. Garments were evaluated first for warmth, durability, and efficiency. Beauty was secondary, often an accidental byproduct of careful design. Finally, clothing reinforced psychological comfort. Familiar layers, carefully arranged and adjusted, provided a sense of control over an otherwise indifferent season. Small victories, dry socks, a warm cloak, A properly layered bed offered reassurance that the cold could be managed. Through textiles, layering, and careful maintenance, humans created a personal, intimate system of survival. Every item carried significance. Every adjustment mattered. Winter was still harsh, but clothing transformed it into something negotiable, manageable, and subtly mastered over generations. Chapter 15. Winter nutrition, heated food, and the slow rituals of sustenance. In winter, eating became more than a simple act of hunger. It was a carefully timed, deliberate practice, intimately tied to warmth, energy conservation, and survival. The season dictated what was eaten, when, and how, shaping daily life in subtle and enduring ways. Breakfast was modest, often as simple porridge, bread, or gruel. It warmed the body gradually, providing calories for the morning without requiring significant preparation or fuel. Fires were fed cautiously and water heated slowly, so meals were optimized for energy efficiency as much as taste. The quiet rhythm of morning sustenance set the tone for the day. Midday meals were heavier, designed to sustain activity during the coldest part of the day. Stews, roasted root vegetables, preserved meats, and soups provided both warmth and nourishment. Cooking times were long, with pots simmering over embers for hours. The kitchen became a secondary hearth, radiating heat into adjacent rooms, softening the chill and extending comfort beyond the meal itself. Evening meals were strategic. They needed to provide sufficient energy to carry inhabitants through long, cold nights. Hot dishes, thickened stews, and spiced beverages were common. Meals were not hurried. They were consumed in measured portions, reflecting both fuel economy and digestive caution. Overeating or moving too quickly could waste energy or introduce discomfort. Food preservation was essential. Cellars, ice houses, and smokehouses allowed staples to last through months when fresh produce was scarce. Root vegetables, grains, salted meats, and dried legumes became the backbone of winter diets. Every stored item represented foresight, planning, and careful management of resources. Consumption was deliberate. Waste was quietly unacceptable. Beverages were managed with similar care. Water had to be melted from snow or drawn from wells, then heated slowly. Hot drinks, herbal infusions, weak beer, or broth provided both hydration and gentle warmth. Drinking was done intentionally, not as a casual habit, with awareness of its impact on energy and body temperature. Meal preparation was itself a slow ritual. Fire tending, stirring, skimming, and monitoring temperatures required attention but rewarded patience. The act of cooking became a form of endurance training, reinforcing rhythm, precision, and the quiet satisfaction of minor victories. Timing, order, and consistency mattered more than culinary innovation. Children participated indirectly, learning both patience and rhythm. They helped with stirring, serving, or gathering fuel. Observation taught them about caloric needs, heat management, and seasonal patterns of food availability. Meals were also opportunities to internalize the subtler lessons of winter: moderation, anticipation, and careful attention to circumstance. Meals were social, but conversation was subdued. Noise and activity were minimized to conserve heat and energy. Eating together reinforced familial bonds and mutual support, but also allowed for practical sharing of warmth and oversight of routines. Even eating utensils and serving methods reflected the season's subtle constraints. Metal spoons were warmed near the fire to prevent chilling food. Bowls were preheated. Portions were planned to maximize heat retention and minimize repeated trips to the fire. Efficiency and comfort were inseparable. Finally, nutrition shaped psychology. Small pleasures, the aroma of cooking, the steam rising from a pot, the comfort of a hot mouthful, were magnified. Satisfaction came from predictability, warmth, and incremental success rather than indulgence. Meals reinforced the broader lesson of winter. Survival was composed of repeated, careful, deliberate actions, each modest in isolation but cumulatively effective. Through food, heating, and slow ritual, humans transformed the season's scarcity into structure. Every meal was both sustenance and strategy, comforting body and mind, reinforcing routine, and quietly asserting control over an otherwise indifferent environment. Chapter 16. Winter lighting, night routines, and the quiet management of darkness. When daylight retreated, humans confronted a new challenge: darkness. Winter nights were long, cold, and demanding, and the careful management of light became central to survival. It shaped routines, work, leisure, and social interaction, imposing subtle rhythms that guided life almost invisibly. Candles were precious. Wax, tallow, or beeswax burns were measured in minutes, not hours. Wicks were trimmed to avoid smoke and maximize longevity. Light was concentrated where needed: a cooking pot, a work surface, a book, or a gathering space. Shadows were accepted elsewhere. Unlit corners were both normal and unremarkable. Firelight remained the primary source of illumination. Hearths radiated warmth and soft light simultaneously, creating small zones of comfort in otherwise dark rooms. People learned to cluster around embers, arrange furniture to maximize visibility, and adjust their positions to balance heat and light. Every movement was deliberate, optimized for multiple needs at once. Night routines were structured and predictable. Tasks requiring attention were scheduled for early evening, when fire and remaining daylight could be combined efficiently. Preparation for sleep followed a slow rhythm: bedding adjusted, clothing layered, embers monitored, and any necessary water or fuel gathered in advance. Interruptions were minimized to reduce exposure to cold and the risk of inefficiency. Work continued in small ways. Mending, spinning, and weaving were common nighttime tasks, performed within the zones of light. Repetitive and quiet, these activities reinforced attention, patience, and skill. They maintained household function while occupying time when outdoor labor was impossible. Socialization adapted to darkness. Conversations were soft, measured, and often brief. Prolonged talking or noise required energy, which was expensive in winter. Visits between households were strategic, combining companionship, warmth, and mutual support. Interaction was deliberate rather than spontaneous. Children learned to adjust. Play became subdued. Reading, storytelling, and simple handiwork dominated hours after dark. Instruction occurred quietly. Observation and imitation were primary teaching methods, as the low light discouraged both energetic movement and prolonged exposure to cold. Sleep itself was carefully managed. Beds were layered with blankets, cloaks, and occasionally heated bricks or pans. Positioning was deliberate, with shared warmth optimized when multiple sleepers were present. People became adept at falling asleep quickly and adjusting minimally through the night, balancing comfort with energy conservation. Nighttime awareness extended to the broader household. Fires were monitored for fuel, smoke, and safety. Doors were closed strategically to conserve heat. Ashes were maintained for reuse. Even in darkness, people remained subtly attentive, guided by habit, observation, and anticipation. Lighting, warmth, and activity became inseparable. Light enabled productivity, but only when paired with heat. Darkness dictated both the limits and the pacing of human endeavor. The interplay of fire, candle, and natural light became a central organizing principle of domestic life, repeated and refined season after season. Finally, darkness reinforced psychological adaptation. Long nights encouraged patience, reflection, and acceptance of monotony. Comfort was incremental, measured in warmth, light, and continuity rather than excitement. Every night reinforced a quiet understanding. Survival depended on careful, deliberate, and repetitive management of both resources and routine. Winter nights were not conquered. They were negotiated, managed, and gradually endured. The rhythms of light, fire, and sleep shaped behavior, molded attention, and guided life in subtle, persistent ways. And through this quiet orchestration, humans continued to survive steadily, without drama, and entirely without rush. Chapter 17. Winter water, sanitation, and the deliberate management of essentials. Winter imposed a particular kind of discipline on water and sanitation. Rivers, wells, and storage vessels froze, and humans were forced to adapt routines that would seem tedious today but were essential for survival. Access to water was no longer convenient. It required planning, attention, and patience. Wells often froze at the surface. Ice had to be broken carefully, using tools designed to avoid contamination and prevent accidents. Buckets were lowered slowly, ropes checked for wear, and water collected in measured amounts. People learned to anticipate daily needs precisely. Too little water risked discomfort and disrupted cooking. Too much meant repeated exposure to cold. Efficiency became instinctual. Snow and ice became backup sources. Melting snow provided drinking water, but the process required fire, time, and careful observation. Too rapid heating risked boiling away volume or concentrating impurities. The rhythm of melting, cooling, and storing water became part of daily life. It was slow, repetitive, and quietly exacting. Household sanitation adapted similarly. Waste disposal, cleaning, and hygiene required attention without exposure to the worst cold. Ash, straw, and soil were used for insulation, absorption, and odor management. Toileting and washing were carefully timed, coordinated with warmth sources, and often clustered near indoor heat to minimize exposure. Efficiency outweighed comfort. In towns, fuel merchants operated on predictable, seasonal rhythms. Deliveries were coordinated to anticipate shortages. Families purchased small amounts at a time, balancing cost, storage capacity, and consumption. Delays were tolerated because they were inevitable. People learned to plan weeks ahead, often reserving stock for the coldest periods. Rural communities engaged in barter and localized exchange. Firewood might be traded for food, textiles, or labor. Snowbound roads limited access to distant markets, so local networks became essential. Neighbors coordinated collection, storage, and sharing. Knowledge of who had extra, who needed help, and which routes were passable became practical wisdom. The flow of fuel created subtle hierarchies. Those with access to larger stores of coal or firewood could negotiate favors, extend loans, or reinforce social ties. Conversely, scarcity required careful patience and observation, forcing households to prioritize essentials over luxuries. Social negotiation occurred quietly, embedded in routine rather than formal transactions. Transport was slow and arduous. Wagons, sleds, or carts moved loads across icy streets and snow-covered paths. Porters and drivers timed trips to daylight hours, consolidated deliveries, and monitored weather conditions closely. Minor delays were routine. Every extra hour of exposure increased physical strain and risk. Efficiency was learned gradually through experience and observation rather than formal instruction. Fuel storage was a matter of domestic skill as well as communal planning. Households insulated woodpiles with straw, positioned coal in dry, accessible areas, and rotated supplies to prevent spoilage or moisture damage. Small adjustments, covering a pile more effectively, stacking logs for airflow, monitoring humidity, could mean the difference between relative comfort and extended discomfort. Peat and turf remained essential in some regions, particularly where forests were scarce. Harvesting, drying, and storing peat required months of preparation. Communities worked collectively to ensure that supply lasted through the harshest periods. Winter trade in these materials created both economic and social interdependence, quietly reinforcing networks of cooperation. Even markets adapted to winter. Vendors concentrated sales into central locations, often near stoves or sheltered spaces. Tradespeople adjusted schedules around light, temperature, and passable roads. The timing, location, and sequence of sales became as much a matter of survival as commerce. Households learned to anticipate not only consumption but distribution. Predicting when deliveries would arrive, how much fuel was left, and the expected duration of cold snaps became a mental practice. Minor miscalculations were inconvenient but rarely catastrophic. Success depended on observation, patience, and slow accumulation of knowledge over seasons and years. Through trade, transport, and careful management, communities created a quiet, self-regulating system. Fuel circulated efficiently, needs were balanced against availability, and social cohesion was reinforced through cooperation and mutual observation. Winter dictated the rhythm, but people learned to work within it, creating stability without drama. And while cold remained indifferent, these networks of fuel distribution, barter, and careful planning allowed humans to survive collectively. Comfort was partial, incremental, and always dependent on repetition and attention, but it was enough to sustain life through the longest nights. Chapter 20: Winter Rituals, Celebrations, and the Quiet Shaping of Culture. Even in the coldest months, humans found ways to mark time, observe cycles, and preserve a sense of continuity. Winter rituals and celebrations were subtle, deliberate, and often understated, reflecting the season's persistent authority while offering small measures of social and psychological warmth. Communities timed events around light, heat, and availability of resources. Festivals of midwinter, solstice gatherings, and small religious observances were scheduled during periods when survival needs allowed for modest diversion. They were never elaborate spectacles. The emphasis was on continuity, social cohesion, and practical enjoyment within the constraints of cold and darkness. Preparation for these events was slow and deliberate. Food was preserved or allocated carefully, fires tended in advance, and spaces arranged to maximize warmth for gatherings. Decorations, if present, were minimal: a simple wreath, a candle, or an extra layer of cloth to create comfort. Every choice balanced comfort, ritual significance, and resource economy. Meals during celebrations were incremental luxuries. Extra meat, spiced dishes, or sweetened breads were enjoyed, but portioned deliberately. Cooking was an extension of daily routine, just slightly amplified. Heat from prolonged cooking added comfort to rooms, reinforcing both social and physical warmth. Gift-giving was practical as much as symbolic. Spare textiles, small tools, preserved foods, or tokens of labor were exchanged. Luxury was rare, usefulness was valued. Items were chosen to improve survival, comfort, or efficiency in the coming months. Thoughtfulness was demonstrated quietly, not dramatically. Storytelling and music became central. Tales were recounted in familiar rhythms. Songs were slow, repetitive, and easy to follow. The act of participation mattered more than novelty. Collective attention to rhythm, narrative, and shared experience reinforced social bonds while minimizing exertion and exposure to cold. Work slowed during these periods, but not entirely. Routine maintenance, fire tending, water management, and household chores continued in measured increments. Tasks were interleaved with ritual activity, blending necessity with celebration. Even leisure was pragmatic, emphasizing continuity and subtle reinforcement of daily rhythms. Lighting remained a core element. Candles, lamps, and fires were concentrated strategically, creating zones of comfort and visibility. Light signaled both celebration and safety, marking social activity without disrupting the overarching economy of warmth. Children participated under guidance, learning both tradition and practical skills. Games were subdued, repetitive, and coordinated with available heat. Observation and imitation were central to learning, embedding habits of patience, attention, and rhythm that persisted into adulthood. These winter rituals were enduring but unremarkable to outsiders. They lacked spectacle, drama, or urgency. Their value lay in repetition, predictability, and reinforcement of community cohesion. They quietly bridged the gap between survival and cultural continuity, offering modest comfort, reassurance, and structure. Even in celebration, winter's authority remained. Cold was present, darkness was long, and resources were limited. The rituals did not conquer these realities, they accommodated them. Human ingenuity was expressed subtly, in measured warmth, shared effort, and incremental pleasure. Through these slow, deliberate practices, culture evolved alongside endurance. Winter shaped not just physical survival, but social norms, psychological resilience, and the quiet art of communal patience. Over generations, these practices became embedded, forming a lattice of human adaptation that carried the season's lessons forward, season after season. Chapter 21: Winter Illnesses, Domestic Care, and the Slow Vigilance of Health. Winter imposed a subtle but persistent challenge on human health. Cold, dampness, and long nights created conditions in which minor ailments became more common, and maintaining well-being required careful, continuous attention. Unlike dramatic epidemics or sudden injury, winter illnesses were often low-grade, persistent, and quietly exhausting. Coughs, colds, and mild fevers were routine. They did not incapacitate instantly but required adjustment of daily activity. Work slowed. Fires were tended more vigilantly. Clothing and bedding were monitored carefully. Every action was calibrated to conserve energy while maintaining warmth, hygiene, and basic function. Patience became as important as medical knowledge. Care took place within the home, largely domestic rather than institutional. Family members or servants provided support. Hot drinks, heated cloths, layered blankets, and monitored rest were the main interventions. There was no urgency, only deliberate attention to comfort, hydration, and gradual recovery. The goal was slow, steady restoration rather than rapid cure. Observation was critical. Subtle changes, skin color, breathing patterns, energy levels, were noted carefully. These small signals guided intervention, timing of meals, and adjustment of warmth. Mistakes were inconvenient, sometimes prolonging discomfort, but rarely fatal in ordinary cases. Knowledge was cumulative, learned from experience over many seasons. Food and drink became therapeutic. Broths, warm porridges, and sweetened beverages provided both calories and psychological comfort. Meals were scheduled to coincide with moments of greatest need, often in the warmest parts of the home. The act of eating slowly reinforced both bodily resilience and patient habit. Children required particular vigilance. Their smaller bodies cooled faster, and minor illness could become more serious if neglected. Extra layers, proximity to fire, and gentle monitoring were routine. Observation, timing, and repetition were essential skills, passed from one generation to the next. Community practices intersected with health management. Shared knowledge about mild ailments, local remedies, and practical care circulated quietly. Advice was often repetitive, slow, and cautious. Remedies were modest, herbal infusions, warmed cloths, and layered bedding rather than dramatic interventions. The emphasis was on steady management, consistency, and minimizing additional stress. Hygiene routines adapted to winter conditions. Water had to be melted, baths were brief, and clothes were layered and dried efficiently. Attention to cleanliness was important, but it was balanced against exposure to cold. Practices were deliberate, minimizing risk while maintaining function. Illness also influenced social rhythms. Households adjusted activity, visiting schedules, and labor allocation to accommodate those affected. Quiet observation, patient care, and low-energy interaction became central strategies. Noise, exertion, or exposure were minimized, preserving warmth, rest, and continuity of daily life. Through all of this, the mental rhythm of winter reinforced physical endurance. Care for the sick required attention, repetition, and patience. Families learned to integrate illness management seamlessly into the broader daily cycle. There was no drama, no sudden heroism, just continuous observation, careful adjustment, and slow, methodical support. Winter illnesses did not conquer households. They were endured, mitigated, and managed with quiet diligence. Health was preserved incrementally through layering, warmth, nourishment, observation, and routine. Survival was a cumulative process, composed of many small, deliberate actions repeated over long nights and frozen days. Chapter 22: Textile Labor, Clothing Repair, and the Quiet Winter Craft Economy. Winter brought with it a subtle shift in labor priorities. Outdoor work slowed or paused entirely, and attention turned indoors. Among the most pervasive winter occupations were textile production and clothing repair, activities that were repetitive, deliberate, and quietly essential to survival. Spinning dominated the domestic economy. Fibers such as wool, flax, and hemp were transformed into yarn, requiring attention, patience, and steady rhythm. Each rotation of the spindle contributed incrementally to the household's stock of usable thread. It was slow work, rarely exhilarating, but critical for ensuring that garments could be repaired, replaced, or extended to meet the demands of the season. Weaving followed naturally. Looms were tended in small increments, threads adjusted carefully, and fabrics produced steadily over hours. The work required concentration and endurance rather than strength or speed. Patterns were often simple, emphasizing function over decoration. Quality was valued in durability and warmth rather than aesthetics, a reflection of winter's practical imperatives. Knitting and sewing were complementary tasks. Patches, mittens, socks, and undergarments were created or repaired continuously. Techniques were passed quietly from parent to child, apprentice to master, or neighbor to neighbor. Repetition ingrained skill, and skill ensured comfort, warmth, and modest efficiency in resource use. Each stitch was a minor act of survival. Repair was as important as creation. Clothing accumulated damage from repeated wear, exposure to cold, and household chores. Mending became a deliberate, routine practice. Torn seams stitched, holes patched, worn fabric reinforced. Efficiency and longevity were paramount. Extravagance was rarely considered. Successful repair extended the life of garments, reducing the burden of acquiring new materials in resource-constrained months. Small-scale production also contributed to the household economy. Excess yarn or fabric could be traded locally for food, fuel, or labor. Communities developed subtle, informal networks in which textile goods circulated, quietly reinforcing social cohesion. The exchange was slow and predictable, reflecting both scarcity and seasonally aligned need. Children participated in simplified versions of these crafts. They learned to spin, weave, or stitch slowly under supervision. Repetition, observation, and incremental skill building formed the foundation of both survival and future productivity. Play and learning merged with work, embedding practical knowledge without pressure or spectacle. Indoor craft work also reinforced rhythm, patience, and mental focus. The quiet repetition of spinning wheels, loom adjustments, and stitching created a steady background to daily life. Work became a form of meditation. Time was marked not by clock or sun but by incremental progress on fiber, fabric, and garments. Even modest innovations mattered. Heated rooms, small stoves, and strategic lighting allowed artisans to extend working hours safely. Observation and careful adjustment of temperature and light were crucial. Too little heat made hands stiff. Too much smoke or flame threatened safety and comfort. Incremental environmental control amplified productivity without disrupting the steady flow of routine. Through textile labor, repair, and small-scale production, winter transformed into a season of quiet craft economy. Repetition, attention, and incremental progress dominated both skill development and household survival. Every stitch, every twist of fiber, and every repaired seam reinforced not only warmth and comfort but also the slow, patient rhythms of human adaptation. Winter work was never dramatic. It was unhurried, repetitive, and entirely ordinary. And yet it was precisely these small, deliberate tasks that allowed humans to navigate the cold, maintain functionality, and preserve continuity across long, dark months. Winter imposed limits, but it also fostered expertise. People became attuned to subtle cues: frost thickness, wind direction, snow density, and the performance of tools in cold conditions. Every observation informed future decisions, quietly improving endurance. And so, the economy of winter, labor, transport, trade, and community coordination functioned slowly, predictably, and largely unnoticed. It was an invisible framework that allowed survival in cold months, a testament to the patient intelligence humans applied to the relentless season. Chapter 12: Indoor Pastimes, Quiet Occupations, and the Slow Culture of Winter. Winter nights were long, and while labor continued where necessary, there were hours that could not be spent tending animals, fires, or streets. People filled this time in subtle ways, quietly, almost imperceptibly, shaping a culture of endurance that blended necessity with minimal amusement. Reading existed but was limited by light and resources. Candles were precious, trimmed carefully, used sparingly. Books were handled gently, pages turned deliberately. Knowledge was consumed slowly, not for excitement but for quiet contemplation. Literacy, when available, allowed some degree of mental escape, but always within the constraints of warmth and attention. Storytelling persisted as a domestic ritual. Tales were told without flourish, often repeating familiar narratives. The pleasure was not in suspense or drama, but in the rhythm of words, the cadence of memory, and the company of others. Everyone knew the ending. That was part of the comfort. Predictability was soothing. Repetition was reassuring. Music, when present, followed a similar logic. Instruments were played softly. Songs were slow and low. The act of performance was as much about marking the passage of time as entertainment. Noise was a resource to be managed, energy and warmth were conserved. Even singing was deliberate, measured, and minimally taxing. Handwork dominated indoor hours. Spinning, knitting, mending, weaving, and embroidery kept hands warm and minds engaged. These activities were repetitive, predictable, and quietly productive. They served practical purposes, maintaining clothing, preparing gifts, or generating small sources of income. Each movement was slow, deliberate, and unhurried. Efficiency was valued, but urgency was rare. Children were integrated into these routines. They learned to sit patiently, observe, and participate in small tasks. Games were simple, requiring minimal movement and no exposure to cold. Learning patience, repetition, and careful attention became as essential as reading or counting. Winter shaped childhood quietly, molding both skill and temperament. Even domestic chores adopted a slow rhythm. Water had to be carried from wells or melted from snow. Clothes were washed carefully, dried near fires, and folded for efficiency. Floors were swept, ashes managed, and fires tended in small increments. Every action was measured against both energy expenditure and warmth retention. Social rituals adjusted as well. Neighbors might exchange visits, not for conversation alone, but for shared warmth and small economies of fuel. Gifts were modest: extra firewood, a candle, preserved food. Interaction was functional as well as social, a subtle negotiation with both necessity and the season. Illness and fatigue required particular management. Winter exacerbated both, and care was quiet and repetitive. Hot drinks, layered clothing, and strategic warmth were administered without urgency. Recovery was slow, measured in increments of comfort and attention rather than dramatic interventions. Even time itself felt altered. Long nights encouraged observation of small changes. How quickly embers faded, which corner retained warmth, the precise moment frost appeared on a window pane. Days were marked not by clocks but by cycles of light, heat, labor, and rest. Rhythm replaced drama. Consistency replaced surprise. Through all of this, people cultivated patience, careful attention, and a quiet resilience. Winter shaped not only physical survival but also mental and social habits. Every hour was occupied thoughtfully, every action tempered by experience and foresight. In the long arc of the season, entertainment, labor, and domestic management merged into a continuous, deliberate flow. Comfort was incremental. Productivity was modest. Life moved slowly, deliberately, and without spectacle. Chapter 13: Seasonal Psychology, Anticipation, and the Slow Shaping of Human Behavior. Winter exerted influence not just on bodies or routines, but on the mind. Long nights, short days, and persistent cold shaped thought, expectation, and behavior in subtle, cumulative ways. People learned to anticipate discomfort, plan for it, and adjust desires accordingly, often without realizing the extent to which the season guided their lives. Anticipation began long before the first frost. Families monitored weather patterns, sky color, and river conditions. They stored fuel, preserved food, and repaired clothing. Every preparation was a mental rehearsal for months of reduced mobility and exposure to cold. Anticipation was practical, not anxious, and it became habitual over generations. Daily pacing adjusted instinctively. People learned which tasks required energy, which could wait, and which should be combined for efficiency. The mind became attuned to temperature, light, and fatigue, predicting how each day would unfold. Even minor deviations, unexpected frost, a delayed fire, a frozen water source, were processed with calm adaptation. Emotional responses were muted, surprise was minimized. Repetitive tasks reinforced psychological resilience. Spinning, knitting, sweeping, and feeding fires all served dual purposes: practical maintenance and mental conditioning. The repetitive rhythm created a quiet stability. Thoughts moved slowly, in step with hands, embers, and the passage of light. Anxiety was managed not through distraction but through the predictable cadence of work and warmth. Isolation in winter had a subtle effect. People spent more time in close quarters, interacting with fewer individuals. Social circles narrowed. Conversation became measured and efficient. Solitude was prolonged, teaching self-reliance and the patience to endure both quiet and darkness. Reflection deepened. Minds accustomed themselves to minimal stimulation. Expectations shifted as well. Comfort became relative, measured against the previous night, the remaining fuel, or the thickness of one's bedding. Small improvements, extra warmth from a well-fed fire, dry clothing, or a modest meal, produced satisfaction disproportionate to their apparent significance. Desire adjusted downward naturally, aligning with what could realistically be achieved. Children absorbed these psychological lessons early. Play was tempered by practicality. Movement was moderated to conserve energy. Observation, patience, and quiet attention became central to childhood experience. They learned to navigate both the physical and mental landscapes of winter simultaneously. Communities reinforced these adjustments collectively. Shared routines, such as cooperative fire tending, ice harvesting, or bundled errands, reduced uncertainty. Predictable schedules and